In the summer of 1967, Otis Redding disappeared from the music world for 4 days and told nobody where he was going. He was sitting alone on a houseboat in California, scribbling words on napkins and scraps of paper, and every single line he wrote that week sounded less like a song and more like a man quietly saying goodbye to a life he somehow knew was almost over. Bill Graham was one of the most powerful concert promoters in America. He had seen every kind of performer walk through the doors of his venues. He had watched legends fall apart under pressure and watched unknown kids become superstars overnight. He had a sense for people that most men in his position had long since traded away for money and business sense. So when Bill Graham looked at Otis Redding in the summer of 1967 and saw something broken underneath the surface, he did not offer him a record deal or a bigger venue. He offered him a houseboat. The offer came after a concert at the Fillmore in San Francisco. Otis had just delivered one of the most explosive performances of his career, the kind of set that left audiences speechless and musicians in the wings genuinely frightened by what they had just witnessed. But when Otis walked off stage that night, he did not look like a man who had just conquered a room. He looked like a man who had been emptied out. His road manager, Earl Sims, later said that Otis sat in the dressing room for nearly 20 minutes without saying a single word. That was not normal. Otis Redding was never quiet. He was the kind of man who filled every room he entered, not with ego or noise, but with warmth and energy that made everyone around him feel like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. But that night, he was somewhere else entirely. Bill Graham saw it. He pulled Earl aside and said that Otis needed to stop. Not for a week, not for a weekend. He needed to stop completely. Graham had a houseboat docked on Richardson Bay in Sausalito, California. He told Earl to take Otis there and let him breathe. Otis did not want to go. He had shows scheduled, obligations, a calendar packed so tightly there was barely room to sleep. But his throat had been hurting for months. The polyps on his vocal cords had been diagnosed earlier that year, and the doctor had been very clear. If Otis kept screaming into microphones night after night without giving his voice time to heal, he would lose it permanently, not damage it. I'd lose it. The instrument that had carried him from a sharecropping cabin in Dawson, Georgia, to the most important stages in America would simply be gone. So Otis went to the houseboat. The first day, he slept. Not the shallow, restless sleep of a man on a tour bus between cities, but the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had not truly rested in years. Earl said that Otis did not get out of bed until almost noon, which was so unlike him that Earl actually checked to make sure he was breathing. The second day, Otis sat on the deck and watched the water. Richardson Bay in the summer is something that stays with you. The light comes down through the fog in long, silver sheets. The ferries cross back and forth between Sausalito and San Francisco with a slow, unhurried rhythm that has nothing to do with deadlines or sound checks or the relentless machinery of the music industry. Seagulls circle the masts of the boats docked nearby. The water moves. The world keeps going. And if you sit still long enough, something inside you starts to quiet down too. Otis sat on that deck for hours. He did not play guitar. He did not hum melodies. He did not do any of the things musicians do when they are technically resting, but actually still working. He just sat and watched the ships come in from the bay and then watched them go back out again. On the third day, he picked up a guitar. He was not trying to write a song. That is the part that matters most about what happened on that houseboat. Otis Redding was not sitting down with a notebook and a plan, the way a songwriter sits down to fulfill a contract or meet a deadline. He was just playing, strumming the same quiet chord progression over and over, the way you hum to yourself when you are thinking about something else entirely. Earl was sitting nearby, and he said later that he did not even realize at first that Otis was doing something new. It sounded too natural, too accidental, like breathing. Then Otis started singing 2 lines, just 2 lines over and over, in a voice so quiet and so different from anything he had ever recorded that Earl thought for a moment he must be singing someone else's song. "Sitting in the morning sun, I will be sitting when the evening comes." He sang it again. Then he stopped, picked up a pen, and wrote the words on a napkin that had been sitting on the small table next to him. He looked at the napkin for a long time. Then he wrote another line underneath. "Watching the ships roll in, and then I watched them roll away again." That was it. That was all he had. But Earl said that Otis looked at those two lines on that napkin with an expression he had never seen on his face before. Not excitement, not the electric energy that usually came over him when he knew he had something. Something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like he had found something that had been waiting for him, not something he had invented. The fourth day, Otis covered every surface he could find with fragments. Napkins, sheets of hotel stationery he had found tucked in a drawer below deck, the back of a grocery receipt, the margin of a magazine. The words were not polished. They were not arranged with the careful architecture of a professional songwriter who has learned to construct a chorus the way an engineer constructs a bridge. They were scattered, incomplete, circling around a feeling that he was clearly trying to catch before it disappeared. He wrote about wasting time. He wrote about watching the world move without him. He wrote about leaving Georgia and coming all the way to California and arriving at the edge of the continent with nowhere left to go. He wrote about sitting still when everything inside him had always demanded motion. He wrote about peace in a way that did not sound like joy. It sounded like the kind of peace that comes when you have stopped fighting something you cannot change. Earl gathered all of the napkins and the scraps of paper when they left the houseboat. He put them in a paper bag and kept them. He would carry that bag all the way to Memphis months later because somewhere along the way he understood that what Otis had written in those 4 days was not just a song. It was something more than a song. He could not have explained why he felt that way. He just did. When Otis returned to touring, something was different. The performances were still extraordinary, still the kind of shows that left audiences changed in ways they could not fully articulate, but people close to him noticed that he seemed to be singing towards something now rather than away from something. His whole career up to that point had been built on urgency, on the sound of a man running from poverty and obscurity and the brutal limitations that American society had placed around the life of a black boy from rural Georgia. Be every scream, every drop to his knees, every moment of raw theatrical devastation had been powered by that running. But after the houseboat, the urgency was still there, but underneath it was something else. A stillness. Like a man who has made his peace with a long journey and is finally watching the destination come into view. In November of 1967, Otis called Steve Cropper in Memphis and told him he had something, not a finished song, a feeling, a direction. He told Steve to clear the studio because he was coming, and he did not want to waste any time when he got there. Steve Cropper had been playing guitar at Stax Records since before Otis walked through the door as a driver in 1962. He had been there for the recording of These Arms of Mine, the ballad that turned a man with a car and no prospects into the king of soul. He had been there for every major Otis Redding recording session since then. He knew Otis's voice the way a sculptor knows clay. He knew when Otis was performing and when he was telling the truth. When Otis walked into Stax Studios and sat down and played him what he had, Steve went very quiet. Then he picked up his guitar and started playing along. Within 30 minutes, they had a complete song. Steve wrote the line about leaving Georgia and heading for the Frisco Bay because he knew that line was truer than anything he could have invented. It was Otis's actual life, compressed into a single sentence. The boy from the cotton fields who had driven across the entire country in search of something he could not name and ended up sitting on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, watching the water, wondering what it all meant. When they recorded it, the control room went completely silent during playback. Not the polite silence of musicians being respectful. The silence of people who have just heard something they do not quite have words for yet. Otis looked at everyone in that room and said, "This is my first #1 single right here." At the very end of the recording, where the final verse was supposed to go, Otis forgot what he had planned to say. Or maybe he never knew. Maybe that part of the song had always been empty, the way some things in life are supposed to be left unfinished. He looked at Steve and shrugged, and then he did the most natural thing in the world. He whistled. Soft, wandering, melancholy, the way you whistle when you are walking somewhere alone and you are not in any particular hurry to arrive. Steve told him they would come back and record proper lyrics for that section later. Otis said, "Yeah, we will fix it when I get back." He never came back. 3 days after the recording session, Otis Redding boarded a twin-engine plane in Cleveland, Ohio, and disappeared into the fog above Lake Monona, Wisconsin. He was 26 years old. The song he had left unfinished was released 6 weeks later. It went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the first posthumous number 1 single in the history of American popular music. That whistle at the end, the placeholder, the thing he had planned to replace with something better, became the most recognizable moment in the entire song. Because it was not a placeholder at all. It was a goodbye that none of us recognized until it was already too late. As some people write their greatest work under pressure, in the middle of the storm. Otis Redding wrote his sitting still, watching ships come and go, finally quiet enough to hear what he had been carrying all along. If this story moved you, if you felt something listening to what happened on that houseboat in California, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you the stories behind the music, the moments that happened off stage, the silences between the notes where the real truth lives. Share this video with someone who loves music, someone who needs to be reminded that the greatest things are sometimes created not in a rush, not under a spotlight, but in 4 quiet days on the water when nobody is watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what sitting on the dock of the bay means to you. Because that song does not belong to the past. Every single time someone puts it on and closes their eyes and hears that whistle, Otis Redding is still sitting on that houseboat, still watching the ships, still writing something on a napkin that the world will never forget.